The church didn't fall apart because of one man. It collapsed because no one questioned him. He built it on stage lights, celebrity friendships, and sermons designed to feel intimate and modern. He wore designer clothes, spoke in casual language, and preached a version of Christianity that felt accessible to people who had never felt welcome in church before. To many, he looked like proof that faith could be cool, relevant, and alive in the modern world. Behind the pulpit, he was treated like a visionary. Behind the scenes, he was protected like an asset. Carl Lentz rose to prominence as the lead pastor of Hillsong Church NYC, an extension of the globally powerful Hillsong organization, founded in Australia. Hillsong was not just a church, it was a brand. Music charts, conferences, global campuses, and millions of followers across continents. At its peak, Hillsong defined contemporary Christian culture. Lentz was their American face. His congregation included actors, musicians, athletes, and public figures. He baptized celebrities in private pools. He posted photos with famous names. The message was clear. God was moving here, and Carl Lentz was the conduit. Within the church, his authority was immense. Decisions flowed downward. Staff were expected to be loyal, grateful, and silent. Criticism was framed as disunity. Questioning leadership was described as spiritual immaturity. Lentz preached humility. He lived with privilege. Former staff later described a culture where proximity to Carl determined status. Those closest to him had influence. Those who challenged him were marginalized. Meetings revolved around his approval. Boundaries blurred between personal life and spiritual authority. And long before the public ever heard the word affair, there were whispers. Multiple women later alleged that Lentz used his position as pastor to initiate inappropriate relationships. Some described emotional manipulation masked as spiritual guidance. Others said boundaries were crossed during counseling sessions. These were not random encounters, they were facilitated by trust, access, and authority. Internally, concerns were raised. Staff noticed patterns, leadership noticed risk, but nothing stopped. Hillsong's structure centralized power tightly. Senior leaders were insulated. Local staff had limited authority. Complaints moved upward and often disappeared. The priority was image. Hillsong NYC was a flagship. Losing Carl Lentz would mean losing momentum, donations, and cultural relevance. The brand mattered more than accountability. That protection allowed behavior to continue. In 2020, the story finally broke publicly. Carl Lentz was fired from Hillsong Church for what the organization called moral failures. The announcement was vague, sanitized, and carefully worded. No details, no acknowledgement of victims, just a quiet separation. Days later, the truth emerged. Lentz publicly admitted to an extramarital affair. Media scrutiny intensified. Former church members and staff began speaking out, describing years of unchecked behavior, emotional abuse, and institutional silence. What emerged was not a single scandal, but a system. Multiple women alleged sexual misconduct. Some claimed the relationships were not consensual in the true sense. Given the power imbalance between pastor and congregant, others described being drawn into secrecy, guilt, and fear of spiritual consequences. One woman later stated that church leadership knew about concerns long before 2020 and failed to intervene meaningfully. The church denied some allegations, while confirming others were under investigation. But the pattern was unmistakable. Carl Lentz did not operate alone. He operated inside a structure that rewarded charisma and discouraged accountability. As the scandal widened, Hillsong itself came under global scrutiny. Investigations revealed broader issues across campuses, including other pastors accused of abuse, financial mismanagement, and institutional cover-ups. What had been presented as isolated failures began to look systemic. Congregants felt betrayed. If you follow real stories where faith and power collide, this channel is for you. Many had trusted the church with their faith, their families, and their identities. Some had left other churches believing Hillsong was different, modern, safe, transparent. It wasn't. For victims, the damage extended beyond the acts themselves. Speaking out meant facing disbelief, backlash, and accusations of attacking the church. Some were harassed online. Others were quietly pushed out of community spaces they once called home. The cost of truth was isolation. Carl Lentz lost his position, but the consequences stopped there. There was no criminal trial, no public accounting of how long leadership knew, no full transparency into internal investigations. He stepped away from the spotlight. The institution moved on. And that, perhaps, was the most chilling part. The machine did not collapse. The brand survived. The sermons continued. Carl Lentz ruled like a king because his power was useful. He attracted crowds, money, influence, and attention. As long as he delivered those things, warning signs were tolerated. Boundaries were flexible. Accountability was delayed. Faith became the shield, not because belief demands silence, but because institutions exploit it. This was not a story about temptation alone. It was a story about imbalance, about what happens when one voice carries spiritual authority over thousands, and no one is willing to confront it. When trust is centralized and oversight is optional, abuse does not announce itself loudly. It hides behind charisma. It survives through silence. It thrives where image matters more than truth. Carl Lentz did not fall because the system worked. He fell because the truth became impossible to contain. And the question left behind is not about one pastor. It is about how many others are still being protected, not by God, but by institutions afraid to look at what they've allowed. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments.
He called himself a prophet, a chosen messenger of God. To his followers, Tony Alamo was more than a preacher. He was a savior in a dark world, a man who claimed to hear the divine voice and promised eternal life to anyone who obeyed him. But what lay beneath his holy words was a nightmare of manipulation, greed, and unthinkable abuse. Tony Alamo built an empire of fear disguised as faith, and behind the closed doors of his ministry, he created a world where religion was weaponized to control, exploit, and destroy. Tony Alamo's story began like many cult leaders before him, with charm, conviction, and the perfect pitch for salvation. Born Bernie Lazar Hoffman in Joplin, Missouri in 1934, Alamo moved to California in the 1960s chasing fame as a pop singer. When that failed, he reinvented himself as a man of God, claiming that Jesus had appeared to him and called him to spread his word. It was during this rebirth that he met Susan Lipowitz, a woman as ambitious and controlling as he was. Together, they founded the Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Foundation in 1969, headquartered in Hollywood. What began as a small street ministry for runaways and addicts quickly grew into something far more sinister. The Alamos promised spiritual freedom but demanded absolute obedience. Their followers were told to sever ties with their families, surrender their possessions, and dedicate their lives to the church. Those who questioned them were shamed, beaten, or excommunicated. By the mid-1970s, the foundation had relocated to Dyer, Arkansas, where it blossomed into a self-contained community. The Alamos preached daily, broadcast sermons, and ran businesses ranging from construction to clothing manufacturing, all using unpaid labor from their followers. The money poured in, and Tony's control deepened. When Susan died in 1982, something in Tony snapped. He declared that she would be resurrected and ordered followers to pray over her corpse for 6 months, refusing to bury her until the stench became unbearable. He began referring to himself as both prophet and God, claiming Susan spoke to him from heaven. He used fear and scripture to justify every cruelty. Women were told to submit, children were told to obey without question, and anyone who doubted was labeled possessed by demons. Over the next 2 decades, Tony Alamo's ministry evolved into a cult-like compound governed by violence and paranoia. Former followers later described beatings with wooden boards, starvation punishments, and forced labor. Children worked long hours in church businesses, were pulled from school, and taught that the outside world was evil. Alamo's sermons became more apocalyptic and erratic, filled with rants against Catholics, Jews, and the U.S. government. He claimed to be preparing for the end times, building what he called God's kingdom on earth. But behind this divine facade, he was living in depravity, taking underage girls as his spiritual wives. In the 1990s, reports began surfacing that Alamo was forcing young girls, some as young as 9, into marriages with him. He justified it by citing biblical patriarchs who had many wives. Survivors later revealed that he would hold mock wedding ceremonies, declaring the girls his brides and subjecting them to sexual abuse. Parents who resisted were punished, sometimes beaten in front of their children. Federal authorities began investigating, but Alamo was adept at evasion. In 1994, he was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 6 years in prison after being found guilty of hiding millions in church funds. When he was released in 1998, he rebuilt his ministry, smaller but just as dangerous. His compound in Fuke, Arkansas, became the center of renewed allegations of abuse. Former followers who escaped spoke of nightmarish conditions, of children whipped for minor offenses, of forced fasts that lasted days, and of women kept in fear of eternal damnation. In 2008, the FBI raided the compound. What they found confirmed the horrifying rumors. Evidence of child sexual abuse, physical punishment, and control so total it bordered on psychological slavery. 6 women came forward describing how Alamo had taken them as child brides and assaulted them repeatedly. Some were as young as 8 when the abuse began. During his 2009 trial, prosecutors called him a predator who used the Bible as a weapon. The survivors told harrowing stories of manipulation, how Alamo convinced them that sexual acts were holy and that disobedience would bring God's wrath. One victim testified that he forced her to marry him when she was just 9, taking her on trips where he would rape her in hotel rooms. Another said he told her she was chosen by God and would be cursed if she ever told anyone. The courtroom heard hours of testimony detailing not just sexual abuse, but decades of terror inflicted under the guise of religion. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict Tony Alamo on 10 counts of transporting minors across state lines for sex. He was sentenced to 175 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence. The judge called him beyond redemption. Even then, Alamo showed no remorse. In his statement, he railed against the government, claiming he was being persecuted for his faith. To the end, he believed himself untouchable, a prophet above man's law. Tony Alamo died in 2017 in a North Carolina prison at the age of 82. His death closed a chapter in one of the darkest sagas of American evangelical history. But for his victims, the trauma lingers. Many former members still struggle to rebuild their lives after years of indoctrination and abuse. Some remain estranged from family members who are still loyal to Alamo's teachings. Even after his death, remnants of his ministry continued online, spreading his sermons and insisting he was framed by the government. What makes Tony Alamo's story especially chilling is how he turned faith, something meant to heal and uplift, into a tool for domination. He convinced parents to surrender their children, turned prayer into punishment, and built wealth on the backs of those he enslaved spiritually and physically. His followers believed they were serving God. In truth, they were serving a man who saw himself as one. Alamo's legacy is not one of faith, but of fear, a cautionary reminder that charisma without conscience becomes tyranny. He wore religion like armor, using it to deflect every accusation, manipulate every heart, and justify every sin. And yet, for decades, the world looked away, blinded by his rhetoric, comforted by the illusion that a man who preached the Bible could not possibly be evil. But evil often hides behind the holiest masks, and Tony Alamo's was one that promised salvation, but delivered hell instead.
Bill Hybels did not look like a man who needed control. He built his authority through calm words, innovation, and the promise of a better church. Willow Creek Community Church, founded in the suburbs of Chicago, became one of the most influential megachurches in the world. Its leadership model was studied globally. Its conferences trained pastors across continents. Its sermons emphasized humility, service, and integrity. Hybels was presented as a pioneer, the pastor who modernized Christianity without losing its soul. That image protected him for decades. Willow Creek was not just a church, it was an institution with layers of leadership, a board of elders, legal counsel, and a global reputation. And at the center of it all stood Bill Hybels, whose vision shaped everything from sermons to staffing to policy. Inside that structure, his word carried extraordinary weight. For years, women who worked with or around Hybels described a pattern of inappropriate behavior. Private meetings behind closed doors, lingering touches, sexually suggestive comments disguised as humor, invitations that crossed professional and spiritual boundaries. Each incident alone could be dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern. Some women reported feeling trapped, unsure how to refuse a man who was not just their boss, but a spiritual authority admired worldwide. Others feared retaliation, damage to their careers, or being labeled divisive within a church that prized unity above all else. Concerns were raised internally. Instead of independent investigation, leadership chose containment. When allegations reached the church's elder board, they relied heavily on Hybels' own explanations. He denied misconduct. He framed complaints as misunderstandings. Leadership accepted his version and moved to protect the institution. Women who spoke up were discredited. They were accused of exaggeration. Their motives were questioned. Their character was scrutinized. The message was subtle but clear. The cost of speaking out would be higher than the cost of silence. In 2018, the story finally broke publicly. Journalists published detailed accounts from multiple women, including former staff members and congregants. The allegations were consistent, independent, and specific. They described years of unwanted advances and misuse of power. Public pressure mounted. Hybels resigned. But the resignation was framed as a moral failure, not abuse. No admission of wrongdoing. No accountability process that centered victims. Willow Creek leadership initially defended him, issuing statements that questioned the credibility of the women. That response ignited outrage. More women came forward. The scale became undeniable. Under growing scrutiny, Willow Creek commissioned an external review. The findings were devastating. Investigators concluded that church leadership had failed to protect women, mishandled complaints, and prioritized reputation over truth. Senior leaders resigned. The Global Willow Creek Association severed ties. The institution fractured. Bill Hybels continued to deny the allegations. There was no criminal trial. The behavior described did not fit neatly into prosecutable categories, and statutes of limitation further complicated accountability. Once again, the legal system did not provide resolution. For victims, the harm was not abstract. Some described anxiety, spiritual trauma, and lasting damage to their faith. Others left church altogether. The betrayal was not only personal, it was institutional. They had trusted leadership structures designed to protect them. Those structures failed. What made the Hybels case especially chilling was not secrecy, but respectability. This was not a fringe cult or isolated congregation. Willow Creek was considered a model of ethical leadership. Its teachings influenced churches worldwide, and yet, power still went unchecked. Hybels ruled, not through intimidation, but through credibility. His authority was reinforced by success, numbers, and admiration. Those around him believed confronting him would threaten something bigger than any one person. So they waited. And waiting caused damage. This case exposed a dangerous truth about modern megachurch culture. When leaders become brands, accountability becomes optional, boards become loyal, oversight becomes symbolic, and victims are asked implicitly or explicitly to carry the burden quietly. Bill Hybels did not rule like a tyrant. He ruled like a respected patriarch, and that made him harder to stop. Because when abuse wears the face of trust, it is often defended longer than it should be, until the damage is too widespread to ignore. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. John Smyth was never a pastor in the traditional sense. He did not lead a megachurch or preach weekly sermons to crowds. His power came from something quieter and far more dangerous: trust. For decades, Smyth was regarded as a respected Christian leader within elite evangelical circles in the United Kingdom. He was a prominent barrister, a senior figure in Christian youth organizations, and a man welcomed into some of the most prestigious Christian schools in England. Parents trusted him with their sons. Institutions trusted him with authority. No one stopped him. Smyth became deeply involved with the Iwern Trust, an evangelical organization that ran Christian camps for boys from wealthy and influential families, many of whom attended top private schools. These camps were designed to shape future leaders morally, spiritually, and socially. Smyth positioned himself as a mentor. Boys were selected for private spiritual discipline sessions, often framed as moral correction for perceived sins such as masturbation or impure thoughts. What followed was not discipline. It was abuse. Survivors later described being beaten repeatedly with canes and sticks while naked or partially clothed. The beatings were severe, prolonged, and ritualistic. Blood was drawn. Pain was extreme. Smyth documented these acts obsessively, keeping written records that detailed punishments, injuries, and his own twisted justifications. He framed the violence as love. The abuse occurred over years. Victims were sworn to secrecy. They were told the punishment was necessary for spiritual growth. Speaking out would shame their families, damage their futures, and dishonor God, and so they stayed silent. By the early 1980s, senior figures within the evangelical community became aware of concerns. Complaints reached leadership. Evidence existed. Written accounts were circulated quietly among insiders, but no one contacted the police. Instead, Smyth was asked to step back, discreetly. There was no public warning, no accountability, no protection for future victims. Smyth simply left the UK. He relocated to Zimbabwe, where he reinvented himself once again within Christian communities. He continued working with young men. The same patterns emerged. The same abuse continued, now hidden even further from scrutiny. Decades passed. Victims in the UK carried trauma into adulthood. Many struggled with shame, addiction, broken relationships, and faith crisis. Some assumed they were alone. Others believed no one would ever believe them. The truth finally surfaced publicly in 2017, when a major investigation revealed the full scale of Smyth's abuse and the institutional failures that enabled it. Reports confirmed that Christian leaders had known about his actions decades earlier and failed to act. The outrage was immediate, but justice did not come. John Smyth had died in 2018, before facing arrest or trial. Once again, the pattern repeated. The truth arrived after the perpetrator was beyond the reach of the law. Institutions issued apologies, reviews were commissioned, statements acknowledged failure, but for survivors, the damage had already been done. This case exposed something deeply unsettling. The abuse was not hidden because evidence was lacking. It was hidden because confronting it would have implicated powerful people and respected institutions. John Smyth ruled not through charisma or sermons, but through proximity to privilege. He abused boys whose families were conditioned to trust authority. He operated in environments where reputation mattered more than accountability. And when leaders discovered what he had done, they chose silence. They protected the institution. They sacrificed the victims. This was not a failure of faith. It was a failure of courage. John Smyth did not need a pulpit to rule like a king. He only needed people who believed protecting the church was more important than protecting children. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Jonathan Fletcher was known for his gentleness. He spoke softly. He emphasized grace, forgiveness, and humility. As a leading figure at Emmanuel Church Wimbledon and a prominent voice within the conservative evangelical movement in the UK, Fletcher was admired as a thoughtful pastor and spiritual guide. He mentored younger clergy. He shaped churches. He influenced doctrine. He was trusted. Behind that trust was a pattern of abuse that lasted decades. Fletcher's power did not come from theatrics or celebrity. It came from proximity. He positioned himself as a spiritual mentor to young men, often those new to faith or seeking guidance. One-on-one meetings were encouraged. Private prayer sessions were normalized. Physical closeness was framed as pastoral care. Boundaries dissolved quietly. Survivors later described how Fletcher used touch in ways that felt confusing at first. Hands lingering during prayer. Embraces that lasted too long. Physical contact justified as affection or reassurance. Over time, those encounters escalated. Some described coerced physical acts, framed as spiritual exercises. Others spoke of manipulation that blurred consent entirely. What made it especially damaging was the language. Fletcher framed intimacy as healing. He framed obedience as trust. He framed silence as faithfulness. Victims were left unsure how to name what was happening. Many blamed themselves. Others feared that speaking out would mark them as impure or sinful. Concerns did reach leadership. As early as the 1980s and 1990s, reports were made to church authorities. Some senior figures were aware that Fletcher's behavior crossed boundaries. But instead of confronting him publicly or alerting authorities, leaders chose internal handling. Private warnings were issued. Roles were adjusted. Reputations were protected. Fletcher continued preaching. This quiet management allowed abuse to continue for years. The church culture prioritized discretion. Public scandal was seen as a greater threat than private harm. Victims were encouraged to forgive, to move on, to trust leadership. And many did, because they believed the church would not betray them. The truth finally surfaced publicly in 2019, when survivors came forward with detailed accounts of abuse spanning decades. Their stories were consistent. Their trauma was evident. Independent reviews confirmed that the allegations were credible and that leadership had failed to act appropriately. Jonathan Fletcher admitted to sexual abuse. He resigned from ministry. But once again, accountability stopped short. There was no criminal prosecution. Many incidents were beyond the reach of the legal system due to time past. The consequences were spiritual and reputational, not judicial. For survivors, the admission brought mixed emotions. Validation came too late. Damage to faith, trust, and mental health had already set in. Some had spent years questioning their own memories, wondering if they had misunderstood what happened. They hadn't. The review of the case revealed systemic failures. Church leaders had prioritized institutional stability over individual safety. Warning signs were minimized. Patterns were ignored. Silence was mistaken for peace. This was not ignorance. It was avoidance. Jonathan Fletcher ruled like a king, not because he demanded loyalty, but because he was embedded in a system that valued harmony over truth. His authority was reinforced by peers who believed that confronting him would fracture communities and damage witness. So they waited, and waiting caused harm. The aftermath forced the UK evangelical movement to confront uncomfortable questions about power, accountability, and the dangers of unchecked pastoral authority. Reviews were commissioned, apologies were issued, policies were rewritten. But policies do not undo trauma. Jonathan Fletcher's case is a reminder that abuse does not always look violent or obvious. Sometimes it looks like care. Sometimes it looks like guidance. Sometimes it looks like trust slowly turned against the person who offered it. He was not protected by secrecy alone. He was protected by reputation. And when reputation becomes more valuable than truth, the pulpit stops being a place of safety and becomes a shield for harm. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Ravi Zacharias built his authority on intellect. He was not a fiery preacher or a domineering pastor. He was calm, articulate, and persuasive. His voice carried certainty without aggression. His sermons were structured like lectures. His arguments were philosophical, measured, and confident. For millions around the world, Ravi Zacharias represented the intellectual defense of Christianity itself. He debated atheists. He addressed universities. He advised world leaders. To question him was, for many believers, to question the faith. That power followed him everywhere. Through Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, he created a global organization with offices across continents. His books sold in the millions. His conferences attracted packed audiences. He was invited into churches, academic halls, and private meetings with unquestioned respect. And behind that reputation, abuse was unfolding quietly for years. Women later described how Zacharias used his status to initiate inappropriate relationships under the guise of spiritual care. Some were massage therapists, others were ministry associates. They were told they were helping him cope with physical pain, exhaustion, or spiritual burden. What followed was manipulation. Survivors described being coerced into sexual acts framed as therapy, spiritual release, or expressions of trust. Some were told that refusing would cause him harm. Others were warned that speaking out would destroy a ministry that saved souls. The imbalance of power was absolute. Zacharias was not just a client or a pastor. He was a global religious authority. The women involved described fear, confusion, guilt, and spiritual terror. Some were sent messages invoking scripture to justify secrecy and compliance, and for years, the organization around him did not stop it. Concerns were raised internally long before the public learned anything. Reports surfaced as early as 2017, when a woman accused Zacharias of sexual misconduct. The ministry publicly denied wrongdoing and launched an internal review that cleared him. The investigation was limited. The scope was narrow. The outcome protected the institution. Zacharias continued speaking. He continued preaching about morality. He continued being treated as untouchable. When he died in 2020, he was eulogized as a hero of faith. Tributes poured in. Churches mourned. His legacy was celebrated publicly. Then the truth emerged. In 2021, an independent investigation commissioned by his own ministry revealed extensive evidence of sexual abuse. The report concluded that Ravi Zacharias had engaged in sexual misconduct with multiple women over many years, including coercive behavior, exploitation, and spiritual manipulation. The findings were devastating. Internal records showed that ministry resources had been used to conceal behavior. Phones were wiped. Evidence was managed. Non-disclosure agreements were employed. Women were paid for silence. The very institution built to defend truth had protected a lie. For survivors, the public acknowledgement came too late. Many had carried trauma alone, believing no one would ever believe them. Some watched as the man who abused them was praised worldwide for his integrity. That betrayal cut deeply. The ministry issued a public apology. Books were withdrawn. The organization acknowledged systemic failure, but apologies could not undo the damage done to faith, trust, and lives. There was no criminal trial. Zacharias was dead. Justice, once again, arrived after accountability was impossible. This case exposed a dangerous reality about religious celebrity culture. Intelligence became armor. Reputation became insulation. Success became proof of righteousness. And when that happens, warning signs are ignored. Ravi Zacharias ruled like a king not because he demanded obedience, but because he embodied credibility. His authority was reinforced by admiration, by institutional loyalty, and by fear of losing something greater than any one victim. So the system protected him, and the cost was paid quietly, privately, and painfully by those he harmed. This was not a story about temptation. It was a story about unchecked power wearing the mask of wisdom. When brilliance becomes immunity and faith becomes brand, abuse does not need darkness to survive. It survives in plain sight, hidden behind applause. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Robert Morris did not rise from obscurity by accident. As the founding senior pastor of Gateway Church in Southlake, Texas, he became a model of modern American megachurch leadership. His message was polished, motivational, and practical. Prosperity, purpose, and faith made actionable. People came in droves. Attendance numbers soared. Donations flowed freely. His sermons were streamed online, reaching tens of thousands. To the public, he seemed like a charismatic, capable, and untouchable leader. Behind closed doors, however, cracks in the kingdom began to emerge. Multiple former staff members and insiders later came forward to describe a church culture that tolerated intimidation, favoritism, and coercion. Employees said that dissent was discouraged. Leaders who questioned decisions were sidelined or removed. Leadership was centralized, with Maury's approval required for virtually every operational decision. Boundaries between spiritual guidance and management authority were blurred, making it difficult for staff to speak up. The first whispers of misconduct involved financial improprieties and manipulation of donations. Staff described being instructed to encourage congregation members to give far beyond their means, often under spiritual pressure. Letters, sermons, and personal meetings framed generosity as a divine test, implying that refusal could indicate a lack of faith. Some reports suggested that employees who questioned fundraising strategies were warned or threatened. Others described being assigned to PR tasks to manage complaints quietly. The line between spiritual leadership and institutional protection became increasingly opaque. More serious allegations later surfaced, involving claims of inappropriate behavior toward women within the organization. Sources described incidents where staff and volunteers felt pressured into situations they later identified as manipulative or coercive. While no criminal charges were filed, multiple independent investigations and journalistic reports corroborated a pattern of abuse of authority. the exploitation of trust and power rather than overt criminality. The culture of silence enabled the continuation of these abuses. Employees were aware that raising concerns could jeopardize their careers and their standing in a spiritual community. Congregants were encouraged to view the church as infallible, to trust the leadership unquestionably. Those who spoke out risked social and spiritual ostracism. By the mid-2010s, growing scrutiny from former staff and investigative journalists began to shine light on systemic failures. Morris publicly apologized for some actions, describing certain behavior as missteps and lapses in judgment. Internal changes were implemented, including governance reforms and advisory boards, but critics argue these were reactive measures rather than proactive accountability. Gateway Church remains operational and influential, continuing to draw large congregations and financial support. Maurice maintains a public presence, emphasizing vision, growth, and ministry expansion. The legacy of his leadership, however, is now inseparably entwined with questions about unchecked authority, institutional protection, and the costs borne by those who were silenced. Robert Morris ruled like a king, not through direct intimidation, but through charisma, influence, and the appearance of moral authority. The system around him amplified his power, ensuring that challenges were muted, complaints were marginalized, and the facade of spiritual purity endured. The consequences of unchecked influence were subtle but profound. Employees traumatized, congregants misled, and a culture of unquestioning loyalty that left little room for accountability. When authority is treated as sacred, and loyalty is prioritized above truth, abuse does not need secrecy. It thrives in plain sight, cloaked in sermons, donations, and applause. Faith became the shield, admiration became the armor, and the pulpit became a kingdom where only one voice truly ruled. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Jim Jones was not just a pastor. He was a figure whose name would become synonymous with manipulation, control, and ultimate tragedy. Born in 1931, Jones grew up in Indiana and quickly developed a powerful charisma that would later define his life. He combined religious fervor with political rhetoric, blending Christianity with socialist ideology, creating a message that promised equality, salvation, and community. His voice carried conviction, and people followed him first in small Midwestern congregations, and eventually across the globe. Jones founded the People's Temple in the 1950s. Initially, it was a church committed to racial integration and social justice, attracting a diverse following during a time of segregation and inequality in America. People saw him as a progressive minister, someone who challenged social norms, advocated for the poor, and offered hope to the marginalized. But behind the idealism, darkness festered. Jones exercised total control over his followers' lives. Members were encouraged to relinquish personal property, cut ties with family, and submit entirely to his authority. Those who questioned him were publicly humiliated, shunned, or accused of betraying God. Fear, psychological manipulation, and religious doctrine became the tools by which Jones cemented obedience. As the People's Temple grew, so did Jones' obsession with control. He orchestrated relocation to Jonestown, Guyana, a remote settlement designed to isolate his followers from outside influence. Their daily life was regimented. Jones monitored behavior, dictated chores, and used surveillance to maintain loyalty. Children were indoctrinated from birth. Fear of punishment and promises of spiritual reward ensured compliance. Allegations of sexual abuse emerged within the community. Jones reportedly manipulated women and minors under the guise of spiritual guidance. Consent was impossible when one's entire social and religious world was controlled by a single individual claiming divine authority. The threat of divine wrath, public shaming, and isolation silenced victims. In the 1970s, journalists and relatives began raising concerns. Investigations were launched in the United States, but Jones' influence, coupled with his ability to present a facade of social work and religious devotion, complicated enforcement. Government officials and social agencies struggled to intervene effectively, hampered by the remote location of Jonestown and the loyalty of the people inside it. By 1978, the situation had escalated catastrophically. U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan visited Jonestown to investigate reports of abuse. Members attempted to leave with him, triggering violence. Ryan and several others were murdered at an airstrip, escalating the crisis. Jones orchestrated the mass murder-suicide of over 900 followers, including children, through a poisoned drink in what became one of the largest single losses of American civilian life in a non-natural disaster. The tragedy revealed the horrifying consequences of unchecked power. Jim Jones ruled like a king not because of overt tyranny alone, but because of trust weaponized as obedience, loyalty demanded as devotion, and religious belief twisted into fear. Those who could have intervened earlier were limited by the complexity of authority, ideology, and perception. The aftermath left haunting questions. How does one man hold a congregation in absolute submission? How can charisma, ideology, and religious authority mask abuse, manipulation, and ultimately, murder? Families, communities, and survivors were left to grapple with the legacy of lives controlled and destroyed by one pastor's godlike hold. Jones' story is not an anomaly. It is a warning that when religious authority is concentrated, accountability disappears, and silence becomes the law of the land. The consequences can be catastrophic. Faith, in such hands, becomes a tool for domination. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments.